Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. This is Tom Banke with Forward Community Investments, and we're excited to have you join us for today's presentation. Before we get going, I'd like to take this opportunity to share some background on how we got here today. Forward Community Investments is celebrating their 20-year anniversary in 2014. FCI transforms Wisconsin communities by supporting organizations and programs that reduce racial, social, and economic disparities. We have strengthened these communities by offering affordable, flexible loans and expert advisory services that allow organizations to grow sustainably. Our loans, advisory services, and recently added grant funds give FCI the tools to encourage and support initiatives that make positive change possible. Organizations need resources of all kinds, along with the skills and tools to manage them. Technology, volunteers, strong board governance, and financial acumen can provide some answers, but an important first step is to identify your assets and needs, then determine what works best and what can work better. We can help you to figure these out and figure out where you stand and where you want to go. With the help of BMO Harris Bank, we are able to offer this series of webinars to build nonprofit effectiveness. BMO Harris Bank is an active partner in Wisconsin communities and demonstrates strong corporate citizenship as an important part of whom they are and how they approach the community. Volunteerism and corporate responsibility are a key part to the culture at BMO Harris Bank. It's how they demonstrate their commitment to and investment in the communities they serve. Well, we'd like to take this time to get a little bit our participants up to date with some of the technology that we'll be using. You can join the webinar using the telephone number provided in your confirmation email that was sent to you from GoToWebinar, or you can use your computer speakers, which is recommended by GoToWebinar. Questions. We want to make this webinar as interactive as possible, and we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. You can submit them using the chat or questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, we would like to exercise the poll feature. We would like everyone to participate in this first poll, which will ask, what is the role that you currently serve in your organization? And we will launch that right now. And as you can see, as people enter, you'll be able to see who will be joining us on the webinar today. It looks like we've got a pretty good split, a little over 32% executive directors, a little bit higher of the from staff. And so that we will be using this poll feature throughout the webinar, so this is a great idea to kind of give you how we'll be doing those polls. So, and then we would also like to use the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen as well. Please enter your name and your organization. Great, thank you very much. Now we would like to get to a little bit of know about the speakers that will be speaking for us today, as well as the presentation. The presentation will be on shared leadership with Michael Allison, Susan Misra, and Alyssa Perry. Even before the Great Recession, nonprofit leaders were told that they needed to learn how to do more with less. Nonprofits were encouraged to tighten their belts and look outside their organizations for solutions. Convinced that these approaches were not the only way, Michael, Susan, and Alyssa worked with leaders of 27 civic participation organizations from 2008 to 2010 to explore an alternative, building shared leadership within an organization. After 2 years of experimentation with shared leadership, the TCC group conducted an evaluation and found that 78% of participants had increased their awareness, knowledge, and ability to develop staff as leaders at all levels of the organization. The evaluations revealed significant increases in both staff involvement in decision-making and clear and effective accountability structures throughout the cohort. Many of the organizations discovered that they were able to do more effective work with less or the same amount of funds, and reported that the shared leadership eased the stresses of the executive directors. Essentially, the organizations found that they could do more with less funds by doing more with more leadership. Now I'd like to give a little background on our speakers. Michael Allison of Michael Allison Consulting, he describes his work as being a facilitator of positive change. He assists people in working together to better achieve as much as their potential as possible. He works with a wide variety of fields, including advocacy, economic development, health and social services, youth development, and the arts. Susan Misra of the Management Assisting Group has over 13 years of experience in strengthening nonprofits and their board staff leadership. She has worked with over 150 nonprofit organizations and particularly specializes in aligning an organization's internal operations with its social justice values through inclusive, participatory, and an analytically rigorous process. Alyssa Perry joins us from Think, Do, Repeat, and she has helped people and organizations with a social mission to get better at what they do. For over 15 years, she has worked with individuals, teams, organizations, and initiatives to develop leadership that can address complex challenges. Working in partnership with clients, she co-creates and cultivates practices that align structures, processes, and mindsets for living into organizational values. At this time, I'd like to turn the call over to Michael, Susan, and Alyssa.
Great, thanks, Tom. Hello, everyone. We're happy to meet you from both coasts here, converging in Wisconsin virtually. We're excited to talk to you about this topic because it's something that we've all had a lot of interest in and found a lot of value in with working with the clients that we work with. What we're hoping to do today is talk to you a little bit about what we learned first through that initiative that was sponsored by the James Irvine Foundation and managed by the TCC Group, and which was the basis for the article we wrote, but then also talk some about how we've put some of these ideas into practice over the last several years and a number of the new ideas or tweaks that we're learning along the way. Tom just did a nice job for our introductions, so I'll turn this over to Susan to review the agenda that we're going to work with today.
Right. In the next 45, 50 minutes or so, what we'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what is shared leadership and get a sense of where you guys are on our spectrum of leadership, and then talk a little bit about what are the critical elements that need to be in place to be ready to embrace shared leadership and kind of move along a spectrum of leadership flexing over time. And then in the last part of our call, we're going to actually answer some of your questions about how to put this into practice. And we also have some ideas about what are some of the practical ways that people are dancing in complexity around leadership and also challenges that people are facing. So Alyssa, take it away.
All right, great, thank you. Tom and Susan and Mike and everyone out there for joining us. Happy to be with you today. I'm going to go through a few slides with you all that give some framing to the work we were doing at that time and that have developed and framed our thinking on this topic since then. So we have some common ground to have our conversation. So if we go to the first slide, there's some wordy definitions there. But just to get on the sort of same page of what we mean by leadership, Howard Gardner roughly defined intelligence as the ability to create something, solve a challenge, or address an issue that's of value across communities and groups of people. So not a degree, a certification, book learning, a specific type of experience, but the ability to create something, solve a challenge, or address an issue is what makes us intelligent. So leadership then, as a rough definition that we all agreed on in the group, was the practice of developing and exercising intelligence in self, and developing and supporting the intelligence of others. So the role of leadership is not just continuous self-development and learning, but also paying attention to that capacity in others and in the system. So that's a lot of words and a lot of intellectual thought, but if we go to the next slide, there's a very simple definition that was given by Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an educator and civil rights leader. She began one of the first all-black schools. She was around from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s, and she defined leadership as the capacity to respond to a given situation. So that's a pretty good, simple definition that also holds the complexity of what we're about to talk about. So we can go to the next slide and talk about technical and adaptive challenges. So there are many types of challenges that we face in organizations at all levels of the organization. And some of them are more technical, and by technical we mean that there's an application of existing know-how. There's a pretty much known, accepted way to do things. There are sort of best practices, and the people who are best to do that work are the experts or the authorities in that content. For example, I believe everyone on the call is in nonprofits, so for 990 is one example. There's a best practice. There's a way to do it. There's a set, body of information that needs to get into a set place, and the person that you want doing that is an expert in what they do. An adaptive challenge is one that's that can be a little more nebulous, but that doesn't mean it's not a challenge that arises often or that other people don't deal with. For example, an adaptive challenge might be shifting organizational culture. So in shifting organizational culture, there are some promising practices. There's some things out there people have done, but your culture is going to be unique to your organization and the people that make it up. Your values, and how your processes and structures reflect those values. So there is no existing culture that you can lift from somewhere else and bring it over and plop down in your organization and make it work. There's no expert in that situation. So the adaptive situation requires that the people with the challenge are included in the process of resolving that challenge. That's what we call an adaptive situation. That requires adaptive leadership. It requires that the system learn together, learn new ways. And this graphic that you're looking at is drawn from Leadership on the Line by Ron Heifetz and Martin Linsky, and you can look them up for more information on technical and adaptive challenges. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the spectrum that you heard Susan and I believe also Mike refer to in their opening today. So when we talk about the spectrum of leadership, we're talking about multiple styles and manifestations of leadership that exist across the spectrum. So on the left end of the spectrum, we have contexts or challenges that are simple and that are technical, as we just talked about with the last slide. The primary way folks show up in those contexts is directive. And that's fine. There are situations where that is what's needed and what's most appropriate. There is a certain set way of doing something. There are steps. There's a step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for implementing this database or doing your 990 again, for example. In my leadership development work, I also work a lot with firefighters, and there's a good amount of their job that's important. It's probably about 10 to 15% of their time where they absolutely should be in directive mode. They're not going to build consensus about going into a burning building beforehand. So that's one end of the spectrum. And as we flex across to the right end, you'll see complex, adaptive, and the coach's stance. So in complexity, we talk about complex situations, complex context as being context where there is no best practice. Practice is what we call emergent. The challenge that one's facing is adaptive. And the leadership stance at that end of the spectrum is a coach's stance, where we're drawing out the solution from the system by asking good questions and focusing on the leadership of others in the system. So in between there's a whole lot of space, and what we talk about as the role of leadership in this spectrum is to know when the system or a context needs what, and developing the conditions so that leadership can flex across the spectrum and be at the right place in the right time for the right challenge, the right situation. So we talk about this as a spectrum of leadership, and the right end being more shared, and the left end having a more singular direction, more of a singular voice, singular leader. So it's not so much that shared leadership is good and single leadership is bad, but that there is a spectrum. And most of the time we've been sort of conditioned to think of leadership as the one heroic leader or the handful of leaders, and they're exercising leadership more on the left end of the spectrum than they are on the right end of the spectrum. So developing shared leadership is deepening the capacity to flex and be where we need to be at a given point in time. So let's go ahead to the next slide. And, oh, actually, I'm sorry, if we can back up to that other slide. Thank you. And we're actually going to post a poll for you all. So just curious, from those definitions as you understand them so far, we are wanting to know how comfortable you are with these different places on the spectrum. Are you really comfortable with directive leadership, really comfortable with having a coach's stance where it's about inquiry and drawing solutions out of the system? And how comfortable are you with flexing back and forth between these styles?
Okay, I just opened up that first poll with the question, how comfortable are you with directive leadership? And we're looking that we have about 35% looking that are comfortable, about 23 that are very comfortable. We'll close that and we'll share that with the group. So that's kind of the breakdown of the first question. I will go ahead and launch. Did you want me to launch the second one, or did you want to speak a little bit about that, Alyssa?
Oh, thank you. I think we were going to take those into account when we have discussion later on. Susan, is there anything you want to say about them as they're coming in?
No, go ahead and do all three right now, and then we'll see where we are.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So then I'll ask the second one, how comfortable are you with the coach's stance? So I'll launch that right now. Feel free to vote. So as those are coming in, feel free to ask any questions that you may have throughout the process of the webinar. So I'll close that, and I will share those results. So looking at about a good split between about 39% very comfortable and comfortable. And then what I'll do is I will hide that, and then we'll launch the next one with how comfortable are you with flexing back and forth? So feel free to vote on that one as you see it. Okay, so we'll close that and we'll share the results right now. Looking at about 50% are fairly comfortable with that. Are we prepared to move along then? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. I noticed that there were some questions coming in about implementing shared leadership and putting it in place. And we're going to talk about that in a little later. Susan and Mike are both going to be addressing that. So we'll hold that question. There was another question about being proactive as opposed to just responsive. And just to say a little bit about that at this point, yes, leadership should be proactive and not just responsive. And the proactive piece is really about creating the conditions, so constantly developing leadership, making sure that there are processes, structures, mindsets in place so that that flexibility is possible when response is necessary. Hopefully that makes sense, and if not, feel free to ask a follow-up question in the chat box and we'll get to it during the Q&A later on. Thanks.
So we can move to the next slide, please, and I'll pick up here. Thanks, Alyssa. This is a good segue into this slide about flexibility, and it was interesting, and I think this may be true of the nonprofit sector, that I think it was close to 80% of the respondents were comfortable with coaching, and somewhat less, 59, 60% were comfortable with directive. And this notion of flexibility is not just about moving between the different ones and moving around. It's about knowing which approach is the right one for the given situation. And so let me just talk a little bit about what this slide has on it, and then give you a couple of examples. So the one leader is analogous to what we're talking about as the directive leader. There's one person in charge issuing directions and looking for other people really to comply. At best, you develop commitment to what the instructions are that are being given, but there's not a lot of latitude being given. You're giving very clear directions. And at the other end, where there's many leaders, the idea is that a lot more decision-making is being dispersed. And so there's a common adage in management that you want to give people directions about what it is they should be accomplishing, but give them some room in how. In the situation that Alyssa talked about, in the firefighting situation, you don't even want to have a whole lot of variance in how. You want to have clear agreements about how certain things are going to be done and when. It's very bounded, and what you need is for people to execute, to carry work out. But in so many of the situations that we work with and confront and experience every day, and in not only nonprofits, but increasingly in all organizations, the parameters are just not that clear-cut, and they're shifting. So that has to do with whether you're going out and trying to raise money from different people, or you're delivering services, or you're working in an advocacy environment. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of adaptability that's required. And the value of having many people exercising leadership, and again, going back to what Alyssa talked about with leadership, meaning the ability to respond to a given situation, to exercise some decision-making. But the point is not that many leaders is anarchy, or that it's a whole bunch of people who are now, you know, like at the end of the checkerboard, you become a queen or a king of the checkers, and everyone's a king. You don't have many kings. There's still an executive director. There's still a formal organization chart. There is authority present. But what you're working toward is where many people have more span of decision-making. And that's what we mean by leadership. They're responding. They're making decisions about how to respond to a greater number of decisions or situations. And so that spectrum and moving along that spectrum can be very challenging at times. It's not just affected by the situation, it's also affected by the individuals. For people who are newer in their careers, you're going to want to be giving them more direction. And some people prefer to have more direction. So as a leader, you have to balance not only what's going to work best theoretically for the given situation, but for the folks that you have engaged. One of the keys, the heart of that kind of index, the spectrum and the needle that's moving along the spectrum, is trust. And trust is a two-way street. Clearly, in order to delegate increased authority and decision-making, the leaders need to trust the folks that they're empowering, that they're delegating that authority to. But it's just as important that the people receiving that charge have trust in the person giving it to them. That they're and trust means they're getting the clear scoop, they're getting the whole story, but also that they're not going to be caught off guard later, or tripped up, or left hanging out to dry if something goes sideways. And that's a pretty deep level of trust that you're looking to build. So this is not something that's necessarily easy to do right off the bat. It's something that's easier to do as you get to know people better, and they get to know you, but they also get to know their colleagues, because the assumption is that it's not just a unilateral delegation to a group of independent individuals, but you're looking for those individuals to be partnering with each other. So this requires adaptability, certainly on the executive director or the leader's part, but also on the mid-managers and people who aren't in management position, to be able to respond and accept different roles at different times. And the third dimension there that's undergirding this whole model is that there's some a shared leadership norm, and by that we mean people have similar ideas about what's expected and what latitude people have. So one of the folks that was involved in this initiative was Juan Uribe, and he was the executive director, longtime director of Center for Community Advocacy, a farm workers organization on the west coast of central coast of California. And he had been very comfortable for a long time being much more at that one leader end of the spectrum. There were two things that led him to be interested in changing his style. One was that he was increasingly finding resistance from folks, as people came in and gained more experience, there was some bristling and some pushback on receiving the kind of direction that Juan was used to giving. But I think it was also helpful for him to be in a group of other leaders that were starting to think and work with this concept. And it was interesting to see the learning that took place over a 2-year period, because pretty quickly on, Juan said, you know, this sounds like the way we need to go. My folks need to do this. Our organization's going to be better off. He was sold and tried to go into his organization and get other folks involved. And it didn't work. They didn't accept the authority. They didn't trust that he was really giving them latitude, partly because he kept stepping in at odd times with what other people considered micromanaging, and because he was nervous, and he communicated that. And one of the biggest things that Juan described at the end of the 2-year period was how much he had to change in terms of his relationship to folks, and also really his comfort at playing more of that coach's stance that it sounds like a lot of the respondents on this call are already more comfortable with. Alyssa, where am I in time? We got 4 or 5 more minutes, or?
Yeah, more like
4 more minutes
3
for
or
the next
4.
slide.
3 or 4.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So I think we've hit the text there around the variance. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, which speaks about what does it take to engage in this journey that I was just talking about at Center for Community Advocacy. And we identified 5 key things. And the first one is this commitment by senior leadership to change. But as I was saying, in Juan's case, it wasn't just the commitment. It was really developing some skill, some aptitude there. The second thing is some time up front to really educate people to what it is you're talking about, what kind of change you're trying to bring about. And the planning dimension is helping people anticipate different kinds of situations they may encounter. So, you know, if I'm up at the Capitol and I'm lobbying with one of our elected representatives, are you comfortable with me, you know, negotiating on behalf of our organization? Or is that something I need to bring back? Or under what circumstances would I need to do that kind of thing? So that preparation is really critical. This third point is something that we sort of saw as people were getting tripped up in different ways. And that's by fundamental management practices, we mean that the bookkeeping is done well. You know how much money you have, you know how much you're spending. That basic supervision skills are in place. That planning, what is it that we're trying to do as an organization, is effective enough that it's possible to do this kind of delegation. And this goes for governance, and I think facilities and information technology can play more or less of a role. But having the finances, basic supervision and HR, and the planning functions in place, if you don't have those, you really aren't able to delegate as much authority as you might like to, because people don't know what the rules of the road are. They don't know exactly where they're going. They don't have good relationships with their direct supervisors necessarily. And there's issues of finances that come up all the time. The focus on engagement and accountability is related to this commitment and has to do with that norm of leadership I was talking about. And it's very much tied into this identification agreement on shared values across the board. Another organization that we worked with, the Center for Race, Poverty, and Environment in the Central Valley, had an issue really on these norms and the expectation of accountability and engagement as part of their shared values. There were really different understandings about what accountability meant, and so it led to a lot of frustration when not just the executive director, but a couple of senior folks were trying to delegate authority to and decision-making to other people, who then didn't carry it out the way they were expecting and hoping. And there wasn't enough of an ease in communications that people could bring problems back and saw a need to do that. So they needed to back up and really do some clarification about job descriptions, basic expectations around the kind of work that they were trying to accomplish, and what it meant, what different people were responsible for in carrying out their different duties. There's lots more things we could say, but I think we wanted to ask another poll here just to see where you folks are in terms of, how ready you feel like you are to move in this direction, or perhaps already are.
Great, thanks, Mike. I'll go ahead and I'll launch this next poll. Which of these organizational readiness do you have in place? So I just launched that, and I will share those results as people vote. Okay, we'll give it a couple more seconds for individuals to vote, and then I will close that and share that with the audience.
Susan, in the meantime, were there any questions that came up that you thought we should address in the moment?
Let's do the second poll right now, and then we'll go to that question, because I do think there's one person that asked about just, do you need to have the house in order before you can do any of the more kind of sophisticated flexing and adapting across this leadership spectrum, or can you start putting some of these pieces into place to flex along the leadership spectrum before you have kind of these readiness areas in place?
Mm-hmm.
Great, and then I will.
Go ahead.
Yep, and I'll go ahead and I'll launch that second one. Which one of these is your biggest barrier? And I'll launch that, and we'll wait for some responses to be coming in.
I mean, as we're waiting for those responses, I think it's interesting because pretty much all the organizations that I've worked with personally that have been really successful in being able to flex their entire organization along the leadership spectrum, they have had their house in order. Now, that doesn't mean that they were large organizations. Some of them are small, 5-person organizations or 3-person organizations with a lot of volunteers, and some of them have been really large, like 40, 50, even 100 people. But having the house in order, whether you're big or small, has been really critical for them not to end up having a lot of distrust, which makes it impossible to flex along the spectrum. So that's just been my own experience. Mike and Alyssa, what has been your experience?
I've found that if they have, 4 of the 5, or sometimes even 3 of the 4, but 3 of the 5, but a 4th one is pretty strong, It's okay to move. It just depends on where we begin moving. For example, I worked with one organization that had 85 staff working in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and a lot of what was a barrier for trust for them was around alignment around values and mindsets, and having that in alignment with the structures and processes that they were working with. And there was a lot of distrust because people felt that values and agreements were being violated. So we used work in that area to build trust as an entry point for developing shared leadership, if that makes sense. So I think there are ways into some of these readiness places if the other factors are in place to focus on that readiness factor as a process for developing shared leadership.
Mike, what about you?
I would agree that I think most of these things are really important, and that probably the commitment by the senior leadership is maybe the one that you just have to have. If you don't have that, and by explicit, it's not just that it's manifest in public, but it's real. People are going to be really skittish about really exercising much initiative, and they'll be afraid of getting burned. Now, if that commitment is in process, but there's a really high level of trust, and there's a sense of really being on the same page in other ways, and so forth, then then you may be able to do that even while where folks basically help the leader learn how to calibrate and to move along that spectrum. Sometimes even encourage the leader to retain that directive role in certain cases, that it's not all about wanting more authority. It's like sometimes people say, make this decision, we'll be happy with it.
Right. I think the leadership one is really interesting. When we were preparing for this, one of the things that we noted was there's an irony in that in order for an organization to be more flexible in where it is on the leadership spectrum, you need the people with positional leadership authority to actually kind of drive or shepherd or be a champion of that effort. And not that it couldn't happen to a certain extent without the executive director being on board, but for the whole organization to pivot, you really do need to have that executive director, and it can make all the difference in the world. Like I worked with one foundation in the Midwest where they did a leadership search, and the person who came in as the executive director had a real commitment to sharing leadership, as it seems many of the people on this phone call have. And because that person was committed, they changed the foundation pretty much overnight, where they started to ask their staff at all different levels for their opinion, to create spaces for those staff to come together to talk about and understand what was going on in the community and to figure out how the foundation could respond to that, which had never really happened before in that way. And when the staff started to send decisions back to the executive director to make the final calls, that executive director really held the position of saying, in this particular case, I'm going to send it back to you. You guys need to, help me. We need to make this decision together. And it was fascinating because in most of those cases, going back to what Alyssa said, where it was an adaptive question, like how do we serve the community? What is the best way to provide funding that honors the diversity and inclusivity of our community? All of those questions, this executive director passed that back to be shared by the entire staff. When it came to very technical problems, he made decisions just like that, like this is how we're going to handle email in the office space, or this is how we're going to handle, work hours. Those simple things, he was able to say, here's the decision, and really freed up the staff to have more of a say in situations that required more adaptive consideration. Let's see.
Example.
So let's move on to the next slide, because it's essentially some of the things that we're learning over the last years, having tried to implement some of the shared leadership practices. And given that so many people here feel comfortable flexing along that spectrum and feel comfortable in the coaching stance, these also represent some of the challenges that we've been facing by working on that right side of the spectrum. One of them that actually came up in the question here is, what is the board's role? And quite frankly, we've been really challenged with what here is listed as connection, disconnection with the influencing bodies. Like, if you are working on an organizational side and the staff is getting very involved with shared leadership, what is the role of the board in that? Do they play a role? Many of the organizations that we work with, the board may have been more of a working board where they were highly involved in the day-to-day work of the organization, or maybe they were more of a governing board where they were really involved in the policy considerations of the organization, the overall strategy and direction, but they weren't necessarily involved in specific work. And then the shared leadership model, when you start to flex over onto the right side of the spectrum, there's a real question of, well, how much is the board part of making these decisions, that now the staff is very involved in making the decisions. So maybe we could start there. I mean, Alyssa and Mark, what do you think about this question of what's the role of the board, and what have you seen so far?
It's like, Mike, you want to comment on that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's very hard to have the board be completely not supportive, to be expecting a top-down director and so forth. And where we see this is where there's a lot of board members from the corporate sector who haven't had a lot of experience in the nonprofits, and they're like, well, why are these decisions being made by people farther down? That's a generalization and not always true, but it often is. And I think the other big question is just how involved the board is. If it's, not that engaged, it's less important. But in some ways, it's a less powerful change and dynamic too, if it hasn't actually enlisted the support of the board.
And I would add that the example that I've been most confounded by, talking about the board in terms of shared leadership is tough. I've done some development around shared leadership with boards, but in terms of the board role, as our world changes and the context that we're in are changing, it's becoming a big question that we need to consider as a field. I actually also work at Management Assistance Group with Susan now, and there I've been working on this project that was a learning project with organizations who are working in movement networks. So even though they're distinct 501c3s, they were working in long-term, committed, tight partnership with other organizations across movements and in similar movements to make change. So a lot of times they were dealing with strategy, not even inside the organization. So strategy conversations were happening across organization. What's the role of the board in that context when long-term strategic planning has typically been something that is a governance role? So that's just one example. So that these organizations were sharing leadership towards a movement outcome. So it's even a whole other manifestation of sharing leadership that has huge implications for boards that haven't quite figured out, but we're working with them and sort of learning our way into them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd say that so far my experience has really been that boards are getting in the way versus playing a significant and contributory role in either the case of the staff starting to be more involved in a shared leadership model, or in the case of the networks and partners and allies being more involved in setting direction and making decisions for organizations. So then a lot of that, I think, has to do with our existing concepts of power, and where boards used to feel like, well, we're the ones that are accountable, we're responsible, we're held liable for this organization and we should be making the decisions. And when they start to see decisions coming from the staff or from partners that they weren't involved in, that causes a lot of challenges with them having resistance or outright trying to stop those decisions from coming forward. So I think there's a lot of work needing to be done to figure out how to engage the boards in ways that they can play a contributory role without abusing the power that they have as the governing authority. Another question that has come in is really around practical tools. Like, how do you actually take this and make it practical for people? And some tools people wanted to learn about is, tools for staff to get to know each other, staff and board to get to know each other, tools for executive director evaluations or executive coaching and how those are used. And one of the tools that we found to be very useful are these things called leadership teams, where you think very deliberately about who within the organization should be contributing to making decisions. And in the organizations we work with, that does not necessarily mean the people who are directly reporting to the executive director. It could actually be somebody lower down in an organization, if you have a hierarchical organization, who's got a really interesting and different kind of perspective to add. And so we've been actually working to create these intentional leadership teams that come together quite frequently to really reflect on what's going on in the organization and how to improve and enhance and advance the organization collectively together, and they serve as coordinating bodies. So these leadership teams, I think, are a great tool for organizations to consider. I mean, I think it's more appropriate if your organization is at least 10 staff people. Smaller organizations, your leadership team is probably the people who are actually in the organization, which is different than if you have a larger organization and you need to have a structure for this kind of decision-making and leadership. What other tools, Alyssa, have you seen be really useful for actually implementing shared leadership?
Actually, coaching has been invaluable in these processes. And sometimes it's formal and sometimes it's informal. So, for example, doing, depending on the size of the organization, size of the budget, that kind of thing, there's individual coaching for folks in positions of authority. I've also done some training and workshop development. I know you and Mike have also with peer coaching, so that people are able to have conversations differently with each other around coming up with solutions and drawing out solutions. And then people are able to come to their work with this coach's stance that is not formal coaching, but is more of a communication style that exists more on the right end of the spectrum. Yeah, coaching has been really invaluable, formal and informal, peer and individual, and team coaching as well.
I'd add one quick one. It's just, I don't know if this counts as a tool as much, but we saw in a couple of organizations that doing budgeting differently had a really profound impact on the culture and the willingness of particularly of people to step up. And what they did differently was really just more participatory, where senior management team might have done it completely on its own before, engaging people and really looking through where are we getting our resources, how are we spending them, what choices are we needing to make, and educating people about that whole dimension of the organization brought people in closer, give them more information, but also helped develop a sense of being on the same page.
That's a great example, Mike. Actually, I found that when people do that, the participatory budgeting also really sends a signal to people that people in authority positions are taking this seriously. Because if people get to see the money, they must be really committed to this.
Yeah, it represents power.
Yeah. So.
Right. Okay, last question from folks in the audience is really around time, and time is one of the largest barriers that people are confronting, even if they want to flex more on the shared leadership side. How do you deal with time and making time for this? Have you seen any good tricks or tips around that?
I'd say it's a tough one. It's that it's a real commitment, and it doesn't mean that you have to spend all your time doing this, but it takes care. It's something to do kind of casually because it requires intentionality, and so if you want to make a meaningful shift, it's not just on the margin, and there's no reason not to do this, to gradually move in this direction. But if you want to make a significant shift, preparing people and taking time to coach people through it is going to pay big dividends.
Mm-hmm. And I would say picking a place and sticking with it. I use this phrase a lot. I'm sure Mike and Susan have heard me say it a million times. But my grandmother used to tell me, don't try to boil the ocean, right? So you're not going to try and do this in everything you do immediately or build on every place that you've started to do this already immediately. But pick a place, if it's participatory budgeting or if it's a small coaching initiative, or a few people are getting coaching and maybe there's one training on peer coaching. But pick an area that you think will have some impact on shifting more in the direction you want to go, or developing more capacity for knowing where to be in the spectrum and then flexing there. Pick a place and start there is the best way to manage the time. And also keeping in mind that while it does require more time and slowing down in the beginning, organizations often find that over time they're able to move much more swiftly once they have shared leadership in place more, well, in places kind of not accurate, but once they have a deeper capacity for shared leadership and more trust built, they're able to move more quickly and make decisions more quickly.
That's great. And I'll add that I'm working with one organization. It's a $2 million organization with a large staff, and the two ways that we're actually finding time for this is, one, we're going through and actually systematically looking at the decisions and the areas of leadership and direction setting that need to be made, and saying which ones of these do we actually need to use shared leadership for, because if there are things that can be done in the single leader mode, let's do those that way so that we free up time for the more complex work. And the other thing that we're doing is, it turns out there were lots of inefficiencies already embedded within the organization, so we're taking existing staff meetings and turning them into spaces where we can practice shared leadership. And that's one of the things that we're able to find time, because it already existed. We're just repurposing it for our needs for shared leadership. So I do believe that we are out of time now. We've covered everything that we wanted to cover, and I believe that some of these materials will be left online as well as a recording. I'm going to pass it back to Tom to wrap us up.
Great. Thank you very much, and just want to tell the audience, please join me in thanking Michael, Susan, and Alyssa for today's content, and to BMO Harris Bank for their support. As you mentioned, the presentation was very valuable, and as with all of our webinars, a recording will be available for playback from our website. We'll be sending a follow-up message to all attendees and registrants with links to more resources from the presentation and the link to the recording as well as the presentation itself. I would encourage all participants to review our website at forwardci.org for more information on how Forward Community Investments might help your organization. Our next installment of the 2014 Virtual Leadership Series will be Designing a Business Model Canvas with Ben Williams of Forward Community Investments on Wednesday, October 29th. You can register for this webinar and find more information about it on our website. Also, this information will be included in the follow-up message that I had mentioned earlier. And then one last note, when you do close your browser from this session, you will be directed to a very concise questionnaire to evaluate today's webinar. Please take a few minutes to complete this survey to help us improve the effectiveness of these offerings and how we can improve ourselves. Thanks again to BMO Harris Bank for making this exceptional learning opportunity available. And thanks again to Michael, Susan, and Alyssa. And take care and enjoy the remainder of your day.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.